So I think the first two items were John's, but he's not here. So maybe Ben, do you want to go over code coverage?
Yeah, if no one else has anything else, let's make sure there's nothing else before I hit that, because that's probably less important unless somebody else has something else they want to talk about. I'll go to that. Going once, going twice. All right. Yeah, so we have a couple issues out around doing code coverage. I don't want to bike shed about the variety of things related to code coverage, because it's not like we've already talked about a lot of that issues, and I think there's consensus that we should do it and all that stuff. I just mostly want to know, this is maybe also something that John should be here for, because the express an opinion. I want to see if we have any opinions about actually CI gating code coverage with high watermarks versus just having it as an informational thing. The idea is I would like to start. Oh, there he is. Okay, never mind. Let's just go with John's stuff beginning then.
Yeah, the API proto changes, I didn't realize we had 2C, so we already discussed those. I mean, I guess if you weren't at the TOC or missed them, feel free to review the PRs. If you don't say anything, they are probably going to be approved, because that's what the direction was in the TOC. So we can skip that unless there's any questions. Cool. Next thing, well, let me give some background. I kind of think our test framework is very powerful, and with that comes a lot of complexity. And it makes it kind of hard to understand as a test writer, and kind of hard to improve it as a test framework developer. So I've been looking to clean it up a bit, because there's been a lot of changes over the past 5 years or so since it's been developed. One of the big things is this abstraction of like the static VMs, which is kind of like running tests on real VMs instead of like our fake synthetic VMs. This is like for the VM testing feature of Istio. So I was thinking maybe we remove this, because I'm pretty sure no one uses it anymore. But I wanted to see if anyone does use it, or if they think there's a compelling reason to keep it around, or if people think we should not try to simplify the framework. So yeah, I know there's a lot of people here that use Prow for their vendor distribution. So I know open source for sure doesn't use it, but I don't know what all the vendors are doing. I think it was added for some things Google is doing, and I think Google's not doing those things anymore.
So to be clear, the current Prow execution doesn't run these tests?
So open source Prow test doesn't use this feature at all. It was added to support. Right. Like there's a variety of features in the test framework to support running Istio tests outside of open source Istio on kind.
Got it.
Which I think is actually fine to have, but having a bunch of these things to support things that no one's using that add a bunch of complexity, that's probably not
right.
Yeah, I mean, I think this ended up being superseded even at Google, I remember. Because now we have the we can just have, there's a factory abstract like interface, so you can create like arbitrary code for setting things up. But I don't know about if any current Googlers would be able to find out if this is still being used. But I'd be in favor of getting rid of it, because I think it was like I wrote it and I know it was supposed to be temporary to begin with.
I can ask around within Google, but doesn't sound just like something I've heard discussed recently.
Cool. Yeah, just let me know. I already have a draft PR to do it, because I was trying to see if it was even feasible. But I wanted to ask mostly Google, but also other people. So I'll wait and hear back from you. Thanks.
Thank you.
All right. I'll do the code cover stuff real quick. Like I said, I don't want to bike shed about the stuff generically about code coverage, because we've already talked about that a lot in the PR, and I think we sort of agree we want to do it. The only real question is, should we gate CI based on a high watermark? The reasons for doing that, I think, are it would help actually push a better incentive structure than we've got today, right? And will also probably let us get rid of that go test nag bot, which we have, which is very ignorable. High watermark is nice, I think, because it doesn't let anyone, obsess over a specific number. It's just if your PR drops it, then the CI will flag it if it drops it below the current high watermark. That's pretty easy to do with a simple makefile target, at least on the Go side. I haven't looked at Rust. So the question is, do we want to do that versus just informationally report coverage and sort of hope people look at it? And when I say the high watermark in the PR gate, I'm not necessarily saying we have to be super strict about never dropping it. It's just that if the percentage is encoded in the makefile as a threshold or something, if we drop it, then it has to be visible in a PR, and approvers have to sign off on the fact that we're dropping it for, because it's a big PR that's hitting and we want it. We were like, okay, we'll drop it because of whatever. I mostly just want to have something that flags, like if your PR drops the coverage below the current threshold, there should be a signal for that. That's hard to miss. So that's it. Mostly to talk about whether we should do that or not. What tool we should use, how much code coverage should have, etc. Not really relevant to that. That's it. Any questions or comments on that and opinions?
Hey Ben, just to make sure I understand what watermark means, you said it was a percentage that's encoded inside the makefile?
Yeah, so the way we had done it before, and we have done it before, and again, what I'm proposing we do here is not for all of Istio. We just maybe do one or two components at the start, do it per component, like Istio CNI. When we were developing that internally, we used code coverage for that piece, and we could maybe do it for cPanel too, because those are nice, sort of standalone components. The way we do that is basically we say whatever the current code coverage is the watermark, right? So if your current branch coverage is like, I don't know, 40%, then that's the high watermark. So if you open a PR that drops the coverage below 40%, which is the current high watermark in the main branch, then it'll get flagged and the PR will go, whoop, sorry, you added code, so it's now 37%. Add some tests to bring that back up, or you've got to drop the percentage, right? It's that kind of positive pressure. It's sort of the same thing the Go test nagbot does, right? Where you need to add tests, because if you add code but don't add tests, it's going to drop the percentage. If you delete codes, percentage goes up for free, which is nice. It's a little more strict, but I do think it's like a good incentive. I understand people are concerned about maybe having that as a gate, but I do think it's like a nice signal. So I'm trying to look for good ways to make this a signal versus just adding it and having it be dumped as an artifact somewhere. Like the coverage percentage is like a CI artifact and no one looks at it. Like we could still do that. That's better than current state where I don't think we actually publish any coverage. But yeah, just looking for any input on using it as a CI gate, which maybe, and again, that is a little more drastic, but it might be nice to experiment with in one of the existing self-contained components and see how that works. But anyway. Yep.
Yeah, thanks for clarifying that. I think it actually does sound like a pretty good idea, honestly. Thank you.
Mitch, I think you were next.
Yeah, I really like the idea of a gate. I mean, we have other gates that are relatively easy to override, like release notes.
That's true. Yeah.
So it doesn't have to be super difficult to override. It's sort of an accountability function. If you overrided the gate, someone might ask why. What the purpose of having a PR that reduced code coverage was. But overall, I think that's a great idea, and having it be the high watermark doesn't make it overly burdensome. Shouldn't slow down our development cycles too much.
Stephen, I think was next.
Yeah, I'm definitely pretty heavily against having it be a gate. I think it's an informational tool. I would, much rather have something in CI that lets me quickly just see, here's the code that changed and here's what's covered, or here is which covered disappeared.
Or maybe like a GitHub bot that's like, this PR drops code coverage by X% versus a hard gate.
Sure.
Yeah.
Like if I deleted some tests there's a bunch of existing code that's uncovered, but if you add a lot of utility functions, those are more lines, and so the percentage is going to drop. But I don't want to write a bunch of trivial tests for getters or like relatively simple things that are yeah, they're just like I fear that it would lead to bad quality tests, possibly stuff with like mocking or just like things that you could also have tests that don't actually assert what you want it to assert, but they do run the code. Like I just don't really think that it is something that like encourages quality tests, which I think is far more important than the number of lines.
I think that's true. Like that's kind of why I don't like line coverage. I like function branch coverage or something. And it's not great, right? It's not perfect, but it does. You do need to kind of understand: are there large swaths of code that have no test coverage? And it's really hard to determine that right now. I agree that like writing bad tests to game the coverage is not good, but I think if you pick coverage metric correctly and have some like buffer built in where it's it's not super strict, it's like within a threshold of 5% or something, then it's a little more reasonable. But in general, like I don't think if you add a bunch of getter functions and you're using branch coverage or something, it really should still be like if you have a test that covers that branch, your getter should still be good. But I understand the concern. I do think though that we need coverage anyway, and I think that kind of leans me more towards making it be informational, at least to kind of see, right? If we can make it informational and see what it does over time, we might be able to see if it like actually does provide use or if it just encourages junk tests. In my experience, it hasn't, depending if you treat it right, but I agree we should probably go cautiously. Who next? Keith or John? I don't remember who was next. Let's go with Keith.
Yeah, I think it was me. I think, well, one, I'm really glad we're having this conversation because I think as a whole, community-wise, I think it would be great for us to be more used to seeking out data, making decisions based on the data. And I think code coverage definitely gives us a data point. But to your point, Ben, this is asking about the gating.
Right.
For me, I guess my open questions are around what code bases are we gating and what options do we have in the ecosystem. So yeah, that is where I was gonna go, Quat. So as Quat mentioned in the chat, a lot of our tests are integration tests in Pilot or in STOD rather. And so those are a lot harder to catch with integration tests. I know Goa has support for that. I saw it announced. I haven't looked at it too deeply. How does that match with like the Istio Z-tunnel integration, for example? Does Rust have similar things? We Istio proxy. How are you going to start testing integration code coverage for Istio proxy? Yeah, there are a lot of different areas here, and maybe it might be helpful if we scope some of this. Like I see you've got two components here, like Istio CNI and Z-tunnel. That might be a good place to start, and then kind of evaluate those results and then iterate onto other pieces. But I do think that it's going to be difficult to have this conversation without talking about the specific pieces of functionality that the tooling ecosystem of each code base has.
I agree. I will say in response to that one of the express goals here is to encourage more cheap unit tests and less expensive integration tests where we can. Because I think like integration tests are always worse if you can express the same thing in a unit test. Like they just are in terms of maintenance, ongoing complexity, cost, debugging, time to run, all that stuff, right? So if we say that our unit test coverage, if we just talk about unit tests, say our unit test coverage, ignoring integration, is X today, I don't think we should ever drop that, right? Now we may say that we are adding coverage elsewhere with an integration test, but I don't think adding integration tests should ever drop the unit test coverage percent if we're doing things correctly. So from that perspective, I was just going to scope it to unit tests. And leave integration tests out of it. Integration tests may cover a lot more. I don't really care. I just don't want the current watermark for unit tests to drop. It may never go up. I don't care. Like I just don't want it to drop, right? That's kind of what I'm proposing with this, is that we just say there's a high watermark. If it drops for unit tests, that should be a signal. And we shouldn't ever have a legitimate reason to do that, because the only legitimate reason that could happen, I think, is if you delete unit tests because you have integration test coverage and you've traded something cheaper and easier to debug and work on for something more expensive and harder to work on, which I don't think we would ever do. But I could be wrong. John, you're next, I think.
Yeah, I have mostly negative opinions here. Largely agreeing with Steven and some of the comments on the thing. I think that in my experience with projects that have code coverage gates, it leads to worse tests, really bad tests. This especially happens with newer contributors who either one see we have a number that measures success, code coverage. I want to get that number up, so I go write a shitty unit test. We already have that today, and we don't have code coverage. It also leads to people saying, I sent a PR and the code coverage isn't high enough anymore. Let me go write a crappy unit test just to make up for that. And it's not, I've never seen like, I don't have good enough coverage. Let me go write a good unit test that's actually providing real coverage. It's always ends up being the case that let me go gain this number so that it goes up to meet whatever arbitrary threshold we set. Like bad unit tests are not useful. And in general, unit tests are not that useful for large portions of Istio. Like Quat said, there's so much code in Istio that's about generating, like probably 50% of the lines of code is generating Envoy config. It's not that useful to unit test a lot of that code, at least in like very low level ways. Like we actually have high level unit tests that don't exercise Envoy, but exercise higher level concepts. I think those are great tests. But that's absolutely not the type of test someone will write when they say, I want to go increase coverage. They'll go generate the retry policy proto in Envoy. It's like, who cares what we generate there in like an isolated unit test? Like, you need to go test that works in the broader system. I do think it's useful as a developer. Like as a big hater of code coverage, I still sometimes click like run test with coverage and see like what tests I've written are actually hitting things to understand, like, did I actually test the things I thought I did, whatever. I think it's useful. So like having tooling to run with code coverage is good. I don't know what really is needed there though, like at least in GoLand. I don't know if everyone uses it, but like it's pretty easy. There's just a button, you run with coverage. I don't mind if that's automated so we can just get a snapshot on every commit. I do think that if we're investing in tooling for that, doing some integration test coverage, like the link we posted, may be useful because that's actually hard to do today, and that's something that I don't actually know, and it does show something more valuable. So I'd be very strongly against blocking in CI. I'm fine reporting. I'm a bit skeptical actually of reporting too much, like but whatever. And by the way, we did actually in the past in Istio report, and it was a nightmare. It caused all sorts of issues and was a huge pain in the ass. So everyone was very happy, I think, when it was removed. And we should learn from some past mistakes.
Okay. Do you have context on the PRs that removed it or some of the discussion?
It was like 5 years ago. So.
All right, I'll go dig to see what the discussion there was. Yeah, I agree what you're saying about like people trying to game the threshold to add low quality tests. But like that's what reviewers are there for, and that you could argue the same thing would happen with the Go Test Nagbot we have today. It says add tests, so you add.
Like Go Test Nagbot's stupid. We can delete that.
Yeah,
I don't care about that.
Okay.
Yeah, like the worst thing that I experienced with the old one all the time is like you would go make a great change, and you're like, I refactored 1,000 lines of code into 15 lines of code, and it does the same thing and it's better. And it's like, oh, well, that was 1,000 lines of coverage code. Now you only have 15 lines, and that's now a lower percentage, like rejected. And then you're like, oh, fine, like now I have to go update the code coverage watermark, and that's maybe owned by different approvers, and now I have to go back and forth, and like, oh, was this intended? It's just a huge pain for literally no benefit. So it's a useful thing to measure, and it's a tool, but I really don't think it's good for gating.
Yeah, and that's like why I prefer like actual logic branch coverage, because it's actually, if you reduce the number of logic branches, you get free coverage. So it's like a win-win. But I agree, there are probably corner cases where it would be something that you would be penalized, even if you actually deleted. There's probably always a corner case. But okay, that makes sense. So I think, sorry, Costin, you were next. Keep going.
Yeah, I have, I have not seen any case where the coverage led to good outcomes. I mean, tracking this coverage just leads to people gaming the system or making bad decisions, or writing bad tests because they cover more lines instead of covering corner cases or things that should be covered. Reviewers are responsible to make sure the quality of the test is there, or whatever needs to be tested is tested. But I don't. I think it's misleading, and the only thing I would block on is a test, kind of a small set of tests that test, kind of the core features and the boundaries or whatever contracts we decide for ambient when we decide them. But we should focus on what's important, which is basically making sure all the alpha features and all the things that are poorly documented have some testing and can be tested in combination, not code coverage numbers.
Okay, so it sounds like we're a no on the gate, but are we a no on reporting? But we're not a no on reporting generally, like maybe as like a CI artifact or something. What about informationally in the PR, like a bot that says like, oh, this PR, do we want each PR to have a signal that the coverage drops, or do we want to have no signals and just like maybe every PR generates a report in Prow as like an artifact or something, a coverage report? Do we want visible signals in the PR or not, I guess is the question at this point.
I would say no, and that's mostly because it's hard to, there's not a good way to Prow to, like what I would want in Prow in general is to be able to run something and then add a comment. And like I wanted this in the past for like benchmarks, for example, where like it would run benchmark and say, hey, look, this is 5% slower.
Right.
It's not a failure. It's not, anything. It's just a comment.
A signal for the
only,
yeah.
The only way to like add a comment is to have GitHub permissions, and you can't really have GitHub permissions for security reasons. So the only thing you can really do is dump a file to artifacts or fail the test. And you can technically fail the test and make it optional, but it confuses everyone when they see.
We don't do that anywhere else, I don't think. Yeah.
We do it only in the release builder, and that's only causes pain from like 2 people who are the release managers, and they quickly learn. And that's for publishing a release, so it's like, rare. So I would say one of 2 things. Either one, we make it really easy to run and collect locally, or we just do it in CI and dump it to artifacts, and then you can look at it.
Okay, I would want to do both. Like I don't want to do anything in CI you can't do locally with like a makefile command. For sure.
But yeah, local is the bare bones for sure. Although I do think like we should go through the integration test coverage thing. The thing is, I don't think it's free. Like it slows down to add coverage, and then like I don't think we'd run everything with coverage all the time. So then, do we have a new job just for coverage? And then is anyone actually maintaining it or looking at it?
So I haven't looked at the integration stuff. I don't know. Yeah, I was just gonna focus on unit to begin with. But okay.
The Z-tunnel stuff is actually probably easier too, because all the Z-tunnel integration tests are just normal tests. So it's probably trivial to do that. I haven't done it either. But
yep. Okay. Okay. So decision is at least local, at least reporting, but probably not reporting in the PR because that's A, tricky with permissions, and B, not easy to do without creating false signals. I guess like, custom adding fake tests. Like, I mean, people can always add crappy tests to try to boost the appearance of their PR. Like that's a problem without coverage, right? Like that's one thing reviewers are supposed to look for is like, are you writing crappy tests or not? The coverage is just like effectively, in my mind, a better go test nag, right? Where it doesn't nag you if you actually did add tests that actually have coverage. But yeah, and we are actually able to have some visibility into how much a single PR impacts that. But I understand what we're saying here. So, okay, decision is we can add it. And, or at least we have issues for it already. I'll add context to those issues. Some of them are good first issues because I feel like it's good for people to pick it up and play with it. But at least we're okay with reporting locally. Yes, exactly, John. People will always try to write bad tests. I will try to write bad tests. The coverage is a nice little hint to make it harder for me to write bad tests that don't actually cover logic. All right. Thanks, guys. That's it.
I just wanted to add one quick thing here. Like I think having it display is great, but I think I'm slightly concerned that without a place to kind of view code coverage over time, that we're not going to be able to I think we're going to be missing that, because ultimately, like, if we put it out in each PR, what's really the action here? How is this going to actually impact behavior, paying down debt, all those sorts of things? It feels like there's an opportunity missing to be able to have some sort of view where we can measure the code coverage of the entire repo. Like, for me, if anything, that would be, in my opinion, that would be more useful than getting per PR code coverage.
The whole thing.
Yeah, because like, I mean, when we look at, like, we're doing, 122 just released. If we're thinking about things for 123, it would be great to be able to look and say, code coverage is on a trend we don't like. It would be great to, for TOC to be able to say, hey, can we get some increased code coverage here and here and here? Yeah, let's add some issues for that.
Okay. We still, I think, probably should do it component by component, because it could be a little bit tricky otherwise, but that makes sense. So, but yeah, and as far as like initial steps, what we get, like, I do think adding integration as like a local makefile step that you can run locally and get a report, and maybe we run in Prow and get a report and dump it as an artifact. At least then we have something we can go look at, right? If it's Go, you can pull down the coverage report and generate or even maybe we generate HTML or whatever, and there you go. And you can just look at that for a given release, a given build, and kind of see what the coverage is. That even though we don't have like a automated feedback for it, there is at least a place you can go look to find out, and we have that in the make process. And then later we can build on that and maybe automate more. If we want more reporting, whatever, we can do that later. But at least getting it in there so we're generating it every time, and it's there to go look at. If you go look at it, I think is probably useful at the bare minimum as a start.
Yeah, I'd agree.
Yeah, John, I do agree that maybe adding more test coverage as a good first issue is not always great, but I do think we need to know, and like generating coverage itself is not that hard probably. So I may farm some of that out. All right, that's it. Thanks.
I don't think there are any other items. Anyone else have anything they want to discuss?
Just another call out from me for 1.23 planning. Well, first of all, really thankful for everybody who helped out, contributed to getting 122 out. Super successful. But this is I think a good time to be thinking proactively about what we want to accomplish in 123. I know there's a lot of follow-up ambient work as well as other opportunities. So kind of in the spirit of what we discussed with code coverage, I added a link in the chat to the doc I've started. I want to obviously add more to it. Just haven't had time to with a lot of the 122 stuff. But maybe in the next couple of sessions we can try to populate this, and maybe TOC might use it as an artifact for planning. So yeah, feel free to add whatever you like to there, and we can discuss.
Great. Anything else? All right. Well, I guess why don't we finish early and see most of you at 10 for the 24 minutes for the ambient meeting. Bye.
Bye, folks.